The wind came down the mountain like a blade, slicing through pine and timber as snow twisted violently across the ridge. Nathaniel Briggs stood on the porch of his secluded Colorado cabin, shoulders hunched beneath a worn wool coat, eyes narrowed against the flurry. He had lived alone up here for 3 winters now. The silence suited him. There were no neighbors, no questions, and no one to look too closely at a man with too many ghosts. A week ago, a letter had arrived, folded in oilskin, the ink faded but legible. A suitable domestic companion has been arranged per your request. She is to arrive within the month, weather permitting. Cooking, cleaning, and basic homestead duties expected, paid in advance. No returns after arrival. Nathaniel had not asked for beauty or charm. He wanted only someone capable, quiet, and strong enough to survive a Colorado winter. But he had not expected her to arrive in the middle of a blizzard. And he had certainly not expected this. Through the curtain of snow, a woman staggered up the ridge, one canvas satchel over her shoulder, another bundle clutched tight to her chest. As she drew near, Nathaniel's brow furrowed. Her belly was unmistakable. She climbed the porch steps, her breath visible in the freezing air, snow clinging to her cloak. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, locked on his. "If you want a refund," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "you'll have to wait until spring. I am not walking back through that storm." Nathaniel stared at her belly, then her face. "I did not pay for a child. I did not ask you to," she replied evenly. "But he is coming either way." The wind howled between them. She did not flinch. For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing. Then, without a word, he reached for her satchel, lifted it gently from her shoulder, and stepped inside. She hesitated only a breath, then followed. The cabin smelled of smoke, cedar, and a meat stew long since simmered down. The hearth glowed faintly with embers. A narrow bed sat in one corner, a pine table in the other, and shelves lined with jars, tools, and books gone untouched for seasons. Nathaniel set her satchel near the fire, dropped a log into the stove, and finally turned to her. "Supper is in 2 hours," he said. "You rest until then." She did not thank him. She only nodded, removed her snow-crusted cloak with slow, stiff fingers, and stepped closer to the heat. Nathaniel watched as she stretched one hand to the fire, the other resting gently on her swollen belly. Her face was thinner than he expected, sharp at the eyes, a mouth that had known more silence than smiles. He tossed a folded blanket toward the cot. "Bed is yours." She nodded again, lowering herself with a quiet wince. Nathaniel turned back to the pantry and stirred the stew. The two of them stayed quiet while the wind screamed like an old ghost across the trees. January moved slowly. Snow clung to the eaves like a second roof, and the wind never stopped its lonely howl. Inside, the woman, Anna as he eventually learned, worked without complaint. She swept the floors, chopped vegetables, and boiled linens. Even heavy with child, she never asked for help, never spoke of backaches or chills. Nathaniel watched her in quiet stretches, from the porch over his morning coffee, through the barn door while feeding the hens. She never smiled, but her hands moved like they remembered better days. She kept the back room neat, though nothing of herself filled it except a worn Bible she never read aloud. They spoke rarely. At supper, sometimes she asked, "Potatoes or cornbread?" "Either," he answered. Sometimes he remarked, "Chickens or running light?" She nodded, rose, and tended to it without another word. It was not warmth, not yet. But it was peace. Until one night, Nathaniel heard it. A muffled sob, barely more than breath, leaked through her door like something escaping against its will. He did not knock. He fed 2 more logs into the stove outside her room, set a tin cup of warm water on the floor, and went back to his chair without a word. When Anna woke, the fire was still strong, the cup empty, but it was the shawl that stopped her. It had been washed and folded neatly at the foot of her bed. Later, in the kitchen, she stood for a long moment before speaking. "You do not have to be kind," she said quietly. "I am not kind," he muttered, not turning from the fire. "Just decent. There is a difference." She studied him, unreadable, then nodded and finished breakfast. That night she found something new on her bed, an old leather-bound medical manual, its spine cracked but clean. A torn scrap of paper marked the chapter halfway through: birth preparation, positioning, midwife alternatives. Anna stood for a long time holding it to her chest. She did not thank him. But at supper, she sat across from him for the first time. The wind moaned against the windows, and in that silence something shifted. It was like a frost line breaking open underground. The snow had begun to melt, if only by inches. Spring crept forward slowly and muddy, reluctant to believe it was welcome. Anna's belly swelled taut like a promise waiting to break. She still worked, though her breath came in shorter pulls, her hands pausing against her lower back when she thought he was not watching. One morning, she found a low stool beside the wash basin, angled just so to let her sit while scrubbing. She never said thank you. He never mentioned it, but the silence between them softened. Then one day she came to him with a small torn envelope, a list written in tight pencil: blankets, boiled string, cotton, scissors, clean. You will have to ask the midwife, she said. Name is Clara Mertz. Tell her I am due at the end of May. Nathaniel nodded, left before sundown, and returned the next day with more than she asked for. He brought soft cloth diapers, muslin swaddles, a jar of castor oil, even a thin, dog-eared book titled The Prairie Woman's Guide to Birth and Recovery. That night she found him hunched at the table, his tongue pressed to his lip, cutting flannel into strips with trembling concentration. You are doing all this, she murmured. Why? He did not look up at first. When he did, his eyes were dark and quiet. Because I buried a son once, he said flatly. I did not get to do a thing for him. This time I will. She sat across from him, hands folded. What happened? Fever, he said after a pause. It took him in 3 days. His mother not long after. Anna's voice softened. I am sorry. He nodded, eyes on the cloth. Me too. The storm came down off the ridge like a beast. Snow and wind slammed the cabin walls, shutters rattled like bones, and the chimney howled like a dying thing. Past midnight, Anna doubled over by the stove, a sharp gasp breaking the quiet. It is time, she whispered. Now? He asked, already rising. She nodded. There was no chance of fetching Clara through that blizzard. Nathaniel swept the table clean, scattered salt and flour across the floor, and ran for the blankets. He boiled water, flipped pages of the guide with shaking hands, read words that no longer made sense. Anna labored in silence at first, then in gasps that twisted her face with pain sharp enough to snap bone. Hours blurred. When the child came, there was no cry. Only a tiny, limp weight slick with blood. Anna slumped back, chest heaving, eyes fluttering. Nathaniel froze, panic boiling, then turned the infant over, patted the tiny back. Nothing. Clear the airways, the book read. He bent low, mouth to mouth, drew bitter fluid, spat, repeated. Once, twice, a cough, a sputter, then a cry, weak but alive. Nathaniel nearly collapsed. He wrapped the boy in clean cloth, laid him against Anna's chest, and sat on the cold floor, drenched in sweat, shaking like a leaf. Anna's fingers moved weakly, brushing the child's cheek. The worst had passed, but Nathaniel did not sleep. By lantern light, he carved a piece of pine, slow and deliberate. Micah. He ran his fingers over the letters. The name he had once carved for a boy buried under prairie sod was now alive again in warm, wriggling flesh. The days that followed carried a quiet neither of them had known before. Anna slept with Micah nestled at her chest. Nathaniel kept the fire high, boots near the stove, the kettle always full. He built a tiny cedar cradle, stitched rough wool into a lining, shaped a rocking chair with careful hands. He even tried knitting a hat, crooked, ugly, lopsided, and when Anna found it on Mika's head, she laughed. Not politely, not bitterly. It was full and startled and alive. Nathaniel turned, mock offended. What is so funny? This hat, she said between giggles. It looks like it is trying to be 3 different hats at once. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. It fits. It does, she said, still smiling, and took his hand without thinking. Something melted. By summer, the cabin no longer looked like a place a man went to disappear. Rows of vegetables pushed stubbornly from the thawed ground. A clothesline fluttered with small shirts. The air smelled of tilled earth, mint, and baking bread. Micah crawled across the floor, babbling sunlight into laughter. Anna wore dirt on her cheek and a red ribbon in her braid, one Nathaniel had left on her pillow without a word. One evening, they sat on the porch, Micah dreaming between them. The breeze whispered through the pines. Nathaniel ran a hand along the new rocking chair beneath him. Every groove was smoothed, every joint fitted with care. Home was not a place, he had carved into the backrest. It was the way you said my name. Anna leaned into his shoulder. You came here for someone to cook, she teased softly. He smiled. But I ended up learning how to breathe. And you reminded me, she whispered, I was never just a widow. They sat there as the mountains turned gold, then lavender, then blue. Nathaniel lifted Micah gently as the boy stirred, the child curling into his chest instinctively. Anna rested her head against him, her fingers tracing the old silver ring he had slid onto her finger weeks earlier. The engraving read Grace found, crooked but true. You saved me more than you know, she said. He kissed the top of her hair. I know. And they rocked, all three, slow and steady, while the night closed around them like a quilt pulled soft against a chill. Some stories do not end with gunshots or glory. They end with quiet redemption, found in the arms of those who dare to stay.